Well, this is another no-brainer. You folks really enjoyed the CPS1 list, and it makes total sense to follow it up with Capcom's awesome sequel, the CPS2. Now sure, I may make a few more controversial decisions. Suddenly my placing of games like Three Wonders ruffled the odd feather last time out, but in the main, well, we have a serious murderer's row of titles to go through here. Some good games are going to be near the back of the pack simply due to the amount of quality on offer. So many legendary titles, such a glittering history. This is Capcom in their absolute heyday, the kings of the arcade. And of course, there's fighting games. A lot of fighting games. There's no time to waste and it's time to go for it, man! So let us begin. It's kind of natural that another Japanese quiz game starts things off. This one is perhaps a bit less interesting than the ones we saw in the CPS1 video because it seems to take up a dating premise. No neat artwork or self-referential stuff here, I'm afraid. As it is, as usual, I can't understand any of the questions, so there's not an awful lot to say. The language barrier is also something of an issue when it comes to this game, a variation on Mahjong. I can just about fumble my way through a perfectly regular game of 4-player Mahjong, but I'm a bit lost with this arcadey heads-up variant. I'm not sure how exactly I go about building hands or anything like that. Alas, I just don't know what I'm doing here. Right, let's start things off proper. We didn't see any sports games whatsoever in the CPS1 video, but now we've got another 3-in-1 cab that's entirely filled with them. And, well, sports aren't exactly Capcom's strongest suit. That's kinda clear. You get a tennis game as well as basketball and football. The tennis game isn't too bad, I suppose, and you do get a chance to play as Chun-Li if you so desire, but the other two titles are quite frankly utter cack. If it wasn't for the tennis game, this would be rock bottom, behind even games that I literally cannot understand. It's kind of confusing having Puzzle Loop 2 here and not the original game, but then that happens when you're dealing with a specific arcade board, I suppose. Mitchell's 2001 game, and indeed Puzzle Loop itself, is perhaps most famous for being subject to quite a strong bit of plagiarism. If you've played PopCap Zuma, you've basically played this, and Mitchell were not happy. The public spats and threats of legal action that resulted are interesting. The game itself, it's never been among my favourite puzzlers, and I just get frustrated with it after a few minutes. I already covered Slam Masters 2 in my video on arcade-only sequels, and if you've watched that then you'll already know what's coming. It's a very average fighting game indeed that removes anything that stood out about the original Saturday Night Slam Masters. The design and graphics are fine, but that's not enough here. This video is going to be absolutely packed full of fighting games, and Ring of Destruction is far behind any other. Now, even though we're still pretty low down here at number 33, starting from this point on we're dealing with titles that are perfectly fine, that you'd happily play and enjoy for a spell. We're all good coming up. Mars Matrix is just unfortunate in that we're going to have some brilliant shooters coming up, and against them, it just about falls to the back of the pack. The things that this game does, like absorbing shots and what have you, are really good. Sadly, there's another game that did them great, and looks-wise it's that little bit more of a generic space shooter than some other titles. Still, it's certainly not a bad game or anything. It's hyper solid. There's always room for another of the more obscure Street Fighter variations, and while this one's not quite as whacked out as Ken Shimagura, it's still kind of fun. Super Gem Fighter is basically a children's fighting game, with classic SF2 characters as well as selections from Darkstalkers and Red Earth, and we also have super deformed characters. The controls are thoroughly simplified, and there's lots of self-referential gubbins going on for fans to spot. It's all quite cool to look at. Obviously not the most in-depth fighting game here, but it would be a bit of fun to play with your offspring in the arcade. Plenty other companies came out to play with the CPS2 board as opposed to the CPS1. Here we have Dimmer Who, a 2000 game from shoot 'em up specialists 18 Rising. The game has a medieval sort of theme going for it, albeit complete with plenty of gigantic tanks that fire endless bullets at you, because that was all the rage back in the 1300s or whatever. We're very much in the realm of bullet hell here, so you may struggle if you're not a big fan of all of that, but it's another solid entry that, again, just gets lost a bit compared to the shmups at the top of the pile. Now, the case of 19XX The War Against Destiny is a little bit different, I suppose. This was once Capcom's premier shoot-'em-up series, but by the time this game came out in 1995, it kind of feels a little bit behind the times. It's a very old-school shooter compared to the new and shiny games that the likes of Cave were creating, or the last Turplan games and what have you. There's nothing specifically wrong with that, it's fine and it looks beautiful. It's just a little old-fashioned, and the series needed a bit of a kick up the arse, and it would indeed get that. Cyberbots is a fighting game follow-up of sorts to Armoured Warriors, a beat-em-up that we're going to see a little later on. Basically, it's a lot like the Mega Drive classic Cyborg Justice, only with an updated graphical sheen. Okay, obviously there's a lot more to it. You pick your fighter and then you also pick your robot. This combination will hopefully take you all the way through the game's story, which is surprisingly complex for a fighting game, as it turns out. The game itself is a jolly fun fighter with the appropriate amount of clanging, chunks of metal flying about everywhere, very heavy weaponry indeed, and a thoroughly intense young man by the name of Jin Saotome. It's a very likeable game indeed as a result. We're back in World War II, and the old 19XX games have been given that new coat of paint thanks to 18 Rising. 1944 The Loop Master is a fantastic entry into the series. It certainly now feels like a much more modern shooter for the time, and it's utterly beautiful as well. This is definitely the closest the series had come to being as iconic as something like 1943 was, even if nowhere near as many people have probably played this one. You should definitely play this if you haven't. And now, an obscurity that I certainly hadn't come across before, but it's another puzzle game that I dig. Janpai Puzzle Choco is like a much more fast-paced and action-packed Shanghai. You get your classic Mahjong tiles and you have to match pairs of them up with each other, but they're always shifting around and so on. The tiles have to be cleared before they either leave the playing area or they collide with each other. If they do, the game's done. It's a simple game and certainly not eye-catching at all, but I get such a kick out of simple puzzlers like this one, and as developers Mitchell were just so freaking good at making games like this. We've got more shooter fun, and this time we're going horizontal. Eco Fighters from 1993 is one of the earliest CPS2 titles, in fact it's the second after Super Street Fighter 2. So, as you can see, it's not as big a looker as a lot of the later games that we've been looking at early doors. But it's very good indeed. It's of the same spirit as the almighty Carrier Airwin, only now you've also got a massive protruding arm to dispense devastation with. A solid game, and also, the strong environmental message hits the mark too. I mean, who wants to play as wussers like Captain Planet with their heart gems and all that bollocks, when you can play as the Eco Fighters and save the planet by blowing shit up? That's the way to handle business. Up next, controversy perhaps? Now, this is quite a famous game and people may be surprised to see Marvel superheroes at number 25. But hear me out, here's my reasoning. It's obviously a very good game, a brilliant game, and it gives you the chance to play as all your favourite Marvel comic stars in a fighting game produced by one of the genre's kins. It's hard to particularly fault it. But future games, most of which we're going to see in this very video, would eclipse this original very quickly, and the Marvel-Capcom partnership would be ridiculously fruitful. That and, well, it just won't do to have so many games in one series all packed into the top end of the list. Things need spreading out a bit. But, well, let's face it, you don't need me to tell you that this is really freaking good, do you? Number 24 sees our first appearance from another big franchise, Darkstalkers. Capcom certainly pushed the hell out of these folks. We've got beautiful designs, big games, and lots of crossover. Comics, cartoons. They went all out to make Darkstalkers a thing, and regardless of whether Capcom succeeded or not, the games were cracking. This is the second game of the lot, and really it only just loses out to the first by virtue of nostalgia. Oh, and there's the third game too. of course. Now, don't worry, we'll be getting to that one eventually. For now, the second title is a nice little evolution of the first. The jump here is hardly the one from Street Fighter 1 to 2, but it's still damn fine. Here's a shocker. We're pretty far into the list by now, and Battle Circuit is the first beat 'em up game that we've seen. This despite the CPS1 list being chock full of them. There's two reasons for this. Obviously the fashion had changed and fighting games were now the order of the day, but it's also because by now Capcom had beat 'em ups down to a fine art, and the ones we're going to see are all excellent. Battle Circuit is a very late one indeed, and a bit more of a light-hearted affair with a bit of a different graphical style, and it's a ton of fun. It's what you would expect, basically, from a company that's been doing classics in this genre for years by this point, over a decade. By 1994, X-Men, as a franchise, had been around for an age, and had already had a ton of video games. Most of them average, some of them dreadful, and honestly only one of them, Konami's arcade beat-em-up, was particularly of note. It's kind of shocking that it took until 1994 for someone to see this group of mutants with special powers and think, why don't we make a fighting game out of this? Capcom must have hardly been able to believe their luck on this one. Needless to say, they took the dropped ball and ran it into the end zone, because Children of the Atom is awesome. You have to remember, back then most of the frickin' X-Men games didn't even bother to give Wolverine his claws, so when this came out it killed every other X-Men game attempt stone dead simply by doing what should have been obvious really damn well. Game design. It's not rocket science, is it? Ah, here's an odd one. Mega Man The Power Battle is a strange game because it could have just as easily been on the CPS1 list. It's the only game to come out on both boards. It would have been silly to put it in both lists, so I chose to stick it here in CPS2 as, well, it just fits nicer, and it can be with its sequel. I hadn't played this before, and I'm not a big Mega Man fan, so this game surprised me. It turns out that when you reduce Mega Man to nothing but boss fights, it actually works very well. You've got the Robot Masters of course, and you've got plenty of weapons to earn from them, although some things are a bit odd. You can't choose who you fight next, for example. This and many other things would be fixed in the sequel, but the first Power Battle is a bloody good one to start things off with. We kick off the top 20 with the first Darkstalkers game. I have a fair bit of nostalgia for this one, oddly not so much for playing it in actual arcades, but for playing it in a good old-fashioned British takeaway. Dad's buying the burgers and chips, and you play while you wait. Alas, you rarely find a slot machine in a takeaway anymore, let alone an arcade cab. Street Fighter 2 was in most takeaways, usually in bootleg form, but oddly enough it seemed like Darkstalkers replaced a bunch of them in 1994, at least around where I lived, and that's where I remember it most. Anywho, who's your favourite? Mine, at least for the first two instalments, has gotta be good old John Talbane. Mainly because his special moves kick ass, but you just can't go on with a big old muscular werewolf, can you? Crappy food, but awesome times. Annoyingly, I already wasted my Cyborg Justice comparison material on Cyberbots, when it would have been more apt here. Still, there's a lot more to talk about with Armoured Warriors, another great Capcom beat-em-up, and another one that sadly never made it to a contemporary console. You've got your usual band of Phil Mitchell approved hard nuts to pick from, but they've also got a big mech suit to step into, and the usual weapons now take the form of special robot arms. So, what would you rather use? A lead pipe? Or a massive frickin' drill arm? I rest my case. For this and plenty of other more typical reasons, Armoured Warriors is a superb Capcom beat-em-up. Not much nostalgia for this one as it goes, I never played it or even I think saw it in an arcade, but it's certainly been a fun trip on MAME every now and again. We've got 3 Street Fighter titles coming that are basically as awesome as each other, and their rankings are pretty much arbitrary. Marvel vs Street Fighter's here at number 18, the crossover concept has fully started to take hold, and we're just one step away from fighting game immortality. We have of course got the awesome tag team action. Well, at least you had it in the arcades and on the Saturn, while PlayStation owners got utterly rogered. And the action is getting ever more extreme, with off-screen partners frequently joining in the fun for quick special moves and really big combos. It's going to get even better than this, of course, but it's already fantastic. The second Street Fighter Alpha game is the first to appear on this list. Now these are all very good. I love the changes to the art style, and the Alpha games were very welcome at a time when already plenty of people were making jokes about the endless variations on Street Fighter 2. Oddly enough though, a lot of my main memories of the Alphas are associated with the home. Believe it or not, I actually had this game's very late and somewhat baffling SNES port. Despite the oddity of loading times in a cartridge and the obviously chopped down graphics and animation, it really wasn't bad at all, considering the platform. Like most of my childhood games, I don't have it anymore. It ended up in a skip because I'm an idiot. Looking on eBay, it now goes for, to say the least, a pretty penny. Nice. Anyway, SF2 Alpha is awesome. I mean, you get to play as the likes of Sodom and Rolento from Final Fight, so how could it not be? There really isn't too much reason why X-Men vs Street Fighter is a couple of places higher than Marvel vs Street Fighter. As I said, these three games in particular are so close that they could have easily been the other way. Everything that I said about Marvel applies here. I guess it simply comes down to enjoying the X-Men roster a little bit more. There's some characters here that you don't necessarily see in too many other fighting games perhaps. Something like that anywho. Both games are bloody great anyway, you probably already know that. But something even greater was, of course, to come. Still be a little while yet before we see that one, mind you. Back to the world of beat-em-ups, and we've got the first of Capcom's two rather spectacular Dungeons & Dragons games. These games are basically the final evolution of a line that started all the way back with Dynasty Wars, going through King of Dragons, Knights of the Round and Warriors of Fate, before getting here. A beat-em-up with a whole load of ambition, more RPG elements and levelling up, more loot, branching paths, while of course still being a beat-em-up that you could have loads of fun with and play with friends. This isn't a coin muncher, it's an epic quest. In doing this, Capcom once again absolutely freaking nailed doing a tie-in game. Cause, well, going on an adventure is exactly what you do when you play D&D, isn't it? Again, sometimes game design really isn't rocket science. Sure beats playing, I don't know, Heroes of the Bloody Lance on a ZX Spectrum. Definitely one of the coolest of the Street Fighter 2 spin-offs, this one. Once again, we've got a nice light-hearted art style, a selection of characters taken from Street Fighter 2 and Darkstalkers, and a superb little competitive puzzle game in a similar vein to the likes of Puyo Puyo. It's also quite a lot like that awesome game Pnickies, which I praised quite strongly in the CPS1 video. This game is, of course, a bit more famous. I'm not particularly good at these competitive puzzle games, you really don't want to see me play Puyo Puyo, believe me, but I do have fun with the eventual utterly hectic nature of it all. Street Fighter Alpha is another odd one that, in some people's eyes, could have been on either this list or the CPS1 one. The story goes that it was planned to be a CPS1 game, but Capcom ran out of CPS1 boards. And a somewhat cut-down CPS1 version of the game does exist, made specifically for the somewhat obscure Capcom CPS Changer console, which is essentially a Capcom-branded supergun. Of course, none of this extra information is to distract from the excellent game. Naturally, much of what I've said about Alpha 2 certainly applies here. This was a great expansion to the whole Street Fighter universe. The whole lore and story do play a big part in the experience, even if they're hardly as central as the fighting experience itself. It's probably the Alpha game I played the most in an actual arcade too, even if it wasn't nearly as much as the SF2 games. It is certainly a classic. Shadow over Mystara is another fantastic Capcom sequel. Like a lot of Capcom sequels, it does everything the first game did, only more so, and even better. More characters, more loot, more RPG elements, and more branching paths to really pull you in and make this feel like so much more than just a regular beat-em-up. The funny thing about this game, and Tower of Doom, is that they make me think of fiddling about with the now pretty old and I'm guessing outdated Kylera netplay servers in MAME, back in like the early mid-2000s. I'd never actually heard of the games before then, and joined the Kylera servers with the hopes of, geez, I don't know, getting a game of The Simpsons going, or Sunset Riders or something like that. But no, literally everyone on there was playing either this or Tower of Doom. That's not even a joke. You could not get anything else going aside from maybe Marvel. Now I don't recall getting many games of anything going at all, because my internet was kinda shit back then, but Still, those are some really fun little bits of nostalgia. The first CPS2 game, of course. There's no better way to introduce your new board with the latest in your flagship series, is there? Vanilla Super Street Fighter 2 is a little unfortunate in that obviously lots more people are going to be playing its much faster iteration, both then and now, but of course that couldn't exist without this. And the new characters are pretty cool too. Cammy is the one I always play with the most, especially nowadays, although I initially remember playing with Fei Long a lot because hey, his fierce kick can hit twice, so he's obviously the best of them. I never used to win too much at Street Fighter. That is when I actually got on and the bigger kids didn't just tell me to quite literally fuck off whenever I challenged them to a match. Good times. The first Mega Man Power Battles game felt like a really neat little bonus to the whole Mega Man experience, but the second game is even better. It feels like a proper full game. Again, this was such a cool little surprise to play. I was expecting something more along the lines of a regular fighting game, but instead you get a whole bunch of really cool boss fights done in the proper Mega Man fashion, along with other folks like Proto to choose from if you don't want to play as the good old Blue Bomber. It's Mega Man, but without all those annoying platforming bits, so what's not to love about it? We had a fair few shoot-em-ups packed into the first half of the list, but now we're in the top 10, here come the biggest guns of the lot, perhaps the two greatest shmups to ever bear the Capcom name. First up is 2001's Pro Gear, published by Capcom but developed by the almighty Cave. This is a horizontal shmup, Cave's first as it goes, and it's all done in a very awesome steampunk style, which was considerably more novel back then. As lovely a game as it is to look at though, the action is just intense as all hell. It looks harder than it is. As with all bullet hell games, only a tiny bit of your ship is vulnerable, but it's still quite vicious, and it certainly gets your adrenaline going when you're making your way through so many shots. But that's part of the fun of these games, what a good bullet hell shooter is all about. For casual players like myself, it's not so much about the memory side of things as it is just about the intensity, and Pro Gear most certainly has that. You should be playing it, like, already. A very special game from 2003 that commemorated the 15th anniversary of Street Fighter, Hyper Street Fighter is essentially Street Fighter 2 getting its Mortal Kombat trilogy type incarnation. A game that allows you to play as all the characters in all of their different variations from World Warrior all the way to SSF2 Turbo. As such, it could be argued that this is the definitive version of the game, or at least it was at one point. But for this list, we're gonna go with the title that had the most impact. So, you know, look out for the sequel to Kensei Meguro Street Fighter 2 in a few entries' time. And we're sticking with Street Fighter for the third and final Alpha game, or Zero if you're in Japan. Alpha 3 has got the lot, from a huge cast of characters that doesn't really leave much out at all, to all of your A-isms, V-isms and Jisms, to the awesome announcer telling you to go for broke and triumph or die, and of course just brilliant fighting game action all the way. Again, this is a game I associate more with playing at home, particularly on the PS1 where it was one of my favourite fighters, or as part of the utterly brilliant Alpha Anthology on PS2. A legendary slab of Street Fighter action of which not a whole lot more needs to be said, but there was just always something in particular about that almighty dramatic battle. As mentioned previously, I frickin' love Pan in all of its forms. All the arcade games are great, and hell, most of the home versions are great too, including the ones on the 8-bit micros. It's tricky to screw such a fun bubble-busting game up, and Mighty Pan, a game that sadly only appeared in the arcades, is the ultimate incarnation. There's nothing particularly new or groundbreaking here, of course. Quite simply, this is Mitchell being completely at one with this game that they've been making for years. Every level seems to bring another cool, fresh or funny riff on the classic Pan formula, whether you have to puzzle them out or get a bit more frantic. It's a very special game indeed, and it's one that a hell of a lot more people should be playing. The first two Darkstalkers games? They were pretty good. But the third? Well, that's the one where they got everything right. The whole art style, while already excellent, seemed to get a big kick up the arse here. It looks bloody amazing. We've got a big gameplay shake-up, with a down system that's more reminiscent of Killer Instinct and is executed very well indeed. and the characters, while already good, get even more additions, including one of the most interesting and greatest characters in fighting game history. There's only one amoral, cold-hearted, and utterly human Uzi-toting gutter snipe, and that's Baby Bonnie Hood. That addition on its own makes Darkstalkers 3 awesome, but everything else? It's one of the absolute best Capcom fighting games, which is saying a lot. It was worth waiting for, and so satisfying to see Capcom utterly nail this formula. When the legendary Toaplan folded in 1994, it was replaced by many companies who specialised in shmups and would basically define the genre going forward. We've already seen Cave and 18 Rising on this very list. Takumi perhaps aren't as well known as those two, but they made the best shmup in Capcom's history, 1999's GigaWin. How so? I mean, you may look at it and wonder what separates it from so many other bullet hell shooters. It's as responsive, as challenging and as pretty as all the good ones in the genre basically are. But the genius here is in the most satisfying mechanic in all bullet hell games: reflecting shots. It feels so good to hold the button down and time it just right so that you send a metric cack-ton of shots right back at the enemy. You get used to throwing out desperation bombs in these games all the time when you're in a tight spot and surrounded by bullets, but here, when you pull off a reflect in a pinch, it's awesome. If you like shmups and you haven't played GigaWin, it's an absolute must, the best Capcom shooter and one of the greatest manic shooters ever. Takumi aren't around anymore, sadly, but you can and should still play this. We've had all those X-Men games, the Marvel games, the initial crossovers, and finally it all leads up to this: Marvel vs Capcom. All of those games were various levels of bloody good, but this is a whole other level. First off, obviously it's awesome to now have a full set of characters from the whole of Capcom's history, not just Street Fighter. We've now got Strider Hiryu, Mega Man, Captain Commando, Morrigan. The love and references are off the charts here. Appropriately enough, the action is spectacular. It's very different to regular Street Fighter, or even to the previous Marvel-related titles that were certainly outlandish, but this goes even further with chains of outrageous super moves, complete with double team action and guest appearances thrown into the carnage. It makes every fight so exciting to both play and watch. There's a good reason why these games are such a fixture in competitive fighting. You show this to anyone and they're going to get the appeal pretty frickin' sharpish. This is, quite deservedly, a classic. I mentioned in the CPS1 video that Cadillacs and Dinosaurs is my all-time favourite Capcom beat-em-up, and indeed it is, especially for the nostalgia that I associate with it. But it's an incredibly close one, Finn, because Alien vs Predator? That's pretty amazing too. I mean, you get to play as a frickin' Predator. Alien vs Predator certainly wins tons of points for being so in-depth. There's a whole load of moves you can do, way more than you usually get in most beat-em-ups, especially when you've got the old Hunter and Warrior under control. And it's not like you should totally disregard those two humanoids either. There's plenty of fun to be had there too. It's just, well, playing as a Predator in this game is everything you ever thought it would be. Shoulder cannons, flying discs, naginatas and claws. It's all here. It's so amazing. Maybe this is my favourite Capcom beat-em-up actually. Or it's Cadillacs and Dinosaurs still. You know what, I just can't decide. It's a pretty nice problem to have, isn't it? Anywho, much like Strider in the CPS1 vid, AVP enjoys basically the same status as the number one, because that position is obvious. Finishing in the runner-up spot therefore is still a big frickin' deal. And of course, all that means that the obvious choice for number one gets it. I mean, it's obvious for a reason. Putting any other CPS2 game in the top spot would basically be wrong. When I talked about hyperfighting in the CPS1 vid, I talked about it essentially being an official bootleg. As a result, it all feels a bit rickety to me. But Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo? This has all the speed, only it's done properly, balanced and fine-tuned, with the result being the king of fighting games. Sometimes I may prefer to play another game in the series over it, but often that's down to sentimental reasons. This is the one. Many people still play this game over 25 years later after all. It's still utterly relevant. Not only do I have so many great memories, first playing it somewhere in Skeggy I believe it was, playing tons of HD Remix on the 360 with pals and so on, but this game still makes memories. Anytime me and good people wind up in a bar or at an expo or anywhere that this is, playing it is basically mandatory. And sure, I'll probably lose, but it doesn't really matter as I've never pretended to be more than a filthy casual. Nostalgia is a big part of lists like this that are all about arcades and the great arcade experience, but Turbo is just timeless. That's the best thing I can say about it. And there we have it. CPS2 is in the books. What an awesome selection of games. Seriously, you should probably play at least 90% of them. Now the same cannot be said about the next arcade board that I would like to do this with, perhaps in a few weeks' time. But still, as a Sega fan, I can't not do System 16. That's to come soon enough, along with plenty more cool vids into the bargain. But until the next time, I shall say, as ever, bye for now. As ever, thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope that they're helping you through these rather tough times. If you like the video, please do like it, do join my awesome comment section, and also have a look at my social media, particularly my Twitter where you'll most often find me, as well as my Patreon where you can also find a lot of exclusives including monthly wrestling documentaries. You can also join this list of awesome people here: Alexa Jones Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Arcade LY Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D. Zalior Rimwan Sutter, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Maiden, Geordie Alex, Glunfeth, Jayas Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lukas Kaligovsky, Mateus Gramzov, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Potter Margel, Renbimon, Rusty Kelly, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Yurka Operator, and to all the rest of my thoroughly awesome community, thank you so much, and goodbye.